We're going to go into Fort Knox to make sure the gold is there. Don't be totally surprised. We open the door, we'll say, there's nothing here. They stole this too. We're actually going to Fort Knox to see if the gold is there, because maybe somebody stole the gold. Tons of gold.
Is there really any gold in Fort Knox? Now, this has been the source of many a conspiracy theory. Certainly with the instability of the economy, there's a lot of people. Some of them get accused of wearing their tinfoil hat, but there's a lot of people that question whether or not there's actually any gold left in Fort Knox. I thought that there was probably no better person to talk to than my pal, Fred Dashevsky. Fred owns U.S. Coin Capital. Fred, welcome back to the program.
Hey, thanks. Great to be with you again.
I guess where I would like to start, Fred, is can you give us just a quick history of the Federal Reserve and how Fort Knox actually came into being?
Well, sure. So the Federal Reserve has a rather interesting history, and you depending upon how far back you want to go, the concept of a central bank, which is what the Federal Reserve is, as many countries have, we have what we refer to as a central bank, whose function and purpose is to be, let's call it the bank to the banks, a lender of last resort, and generally charged by a country to stabilize an economy, to create an environment of full employment, to relegate monetary policy to try to stabilize the value of the currency. They created the United States, the first bank of the U.S. in 1792, but they were smart enough to only give it a 20-year charter. And the idea was that after 20 years, the public could review, how did they do? Are we happy with how they're doing what they've been charged to do? Have they actually created an environment where we have full employment and a stable dollar and things of that nature? After the first 20 years, 1812 comes around, and the kind of concept is that we're not exactly thrilled with how they've performed, and the British merchant bankers took it upon themselves to try to pressure the U.S. This was part of what was going on in the War of 1812, although most of that was over jurisdictional issues of who owned the oceans and how far out it was before you were in open territory, for example. Part of this argument in the War of 1812 was whether or not we should renew this central bank charter. And in the end, they did grant it, and we moved on to 1832. By that point, when Andrew Jackson became president, he was so convinced that it was not beneficial to the public, he refused to sign off on the charter to renew it. And this caused a huge problem for him politically, and he could not find a secretary-treasurer who was willing to go along with him. So he fired his secretary-treasurer and fired the next guy who also refused, and 5 guys after that, until the 7th guy finally agreed to say, okay, I'm with you. We're going to go away with this charter. Well, this battle sort of continued on and off over the decades. When Lincoln became president and when the U.S. was in the throes of the Civil War, wars, of course, as we know historically, are extremely expensive. I mean, they require basically an entire country's economy to shift. We may have to start manufacturing things more aligned with needs of the war, and there's a huge shift there. But during this period, Lincoln also wanted to create an environment that kind of established a way for the country to come together as one. And up to this point, before 1861, a state like Wyoming or South Carolina, they were allowed legally to issue their own money. State banks could create their own currency. And 1861, Lincoln comes around and says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to use the U.S. Treasury as the centralized place for money to be issued. And that means we're going to have one national currency. And those were referred to as greenbacks. That's where the expression comes from. And it came from the bright iridescent green ink on the reverse side of these notes that were issued in the 1860s. So simultaneously, we have our first kind of national paper money, but we also took away the privilege of states to issue their own currency. And there was a lot of pushback there.
Well, it's interesting that there was pushback. And I mean, I can understand it because state A wants to have their currency, state B wants to have their currency. But one of the problems that was created was trading in between states. Because you, correct me if I'm wrong, you might have one state that says my dollar is worth X amount of gold. This other state may value its dollar differently. So you had this flood of currencies that were all different. I mean, if you look back on, and you can do a quick Google search and find pictures of bills that were printed by, the Bank of New York, or there were some in Wyoming that printed their own money.
Absolutely.
Shockingly.
And those are very valuable notes, by the way. If anybody finds any of those original banknotes, they're worth quite a bit of money because, of course, they are not produced anymore and haven't been for those periods. And they're quite valuable amongst the collectors. But you've hit on something that was interesting. A lot of times, like in the early colonial era, the same problem ensued, that the closer you were to the originating bank, it tended to be more valuable. The farther you moved away from that bank, it became a little more progressively difficult to find the same value in the note because, people knew the local bank and they knew where their state was and they knew they could trust it. And again, that became an issue. But the southern states, they looked at it as intrusion by the federal government. In other words, they were claiming states' rights superiority, Ninth and 10th Amendment issues. They were saying that the government on the federal level doesn't have the right to dictate to a state that it can't issue money. And there was huge pushback. But, in the end, of course, they sort of accepted the notion as the Civil War ensued. When the South lost the war, they pretty much accepted the notion that, okay, this is it. We don't have the right anymore to issue any more state notes. And as we carried this concept forward, the Industrial Revolution takes over the 1870s, 1880s. And by the 1880s and 1890s, the U.S. goes through kind of an interesting shift, not only in banking, but in a lot of industries. There was this, I would call it a massive consolidation. So where you had thousands of people in the railroad industry and thousands of individual oil producers, all of these things, steel, production, railroads, oil, and money, began to start consolidating into fewer and fewer more powerful hands. So we know that Rockefeller, for example, ended up with pretty much the ownership of the entire oil industry, and Vanderbilt's on the railroad industry, and such in steel. And these things prevailed. In the monetary policies, everything seemed to center on the big banks in New York. They became progressively more powerful, and they became pretty much the force of money in the United States. So as international trade occurred, it tended to run through the banks of New York. And again, Southerners were not particularly happy about that, but we sort of accepted the notion. Interestingly, a physical event in 1906 set off a chain of events that a lot of people could not have anticipated. It was an earthquake in San Francisco in 1906. It devastated Northern California. And in those days, there were no insurance policies against earthquakes. That was really unusually available. Very few people knew that kind of policy existed, and very few people, if they did, ever took advantage of it. But what people did have was fire insurance. So after the earthquake devastated properties all through Northern California, a lot of properties caught fire. And insurance claims skyrocketed. And the major insurance companies were nearly bankrupt by the flood of attempts to try to collect against policy. And in the end, we ended up with a monetary panic in 1907. And if you ever look this up, it's a really interesting story, the money panic of '07. And it set off a chain of events that nearly devastated the entire nation's economy. And because of all this volatility, there was an outcry from the public for some stability. The government, in response, created what was called the National Committee on Monetary Policy, and they looked to try to come up with a solution. And at the time, a plan was proposed to create a Federal Reserve banking system, or a central bank, basically to say, in the case of the next emergency, financial panic, or any problem that comes up, we need to have some sort of backstop. And this was the promotion for the concept of the Federal Reserve System. Again, even at that time in 1910, a lot of congressmen were really vehemently against this idea. Lewis McFadden probably stands as the most vocal, and if you ever pull up the comments that he made when he read into Congress his rationale for why this should never occur, it stands even today as powerful, powerful information against the idea. But in the end, the panic ensued and the public wanted a solution. So we eventually created the Federal Reserve Bank, which got put into law by an act of Congress in 1913. And by 1914, it had started operations. It was signed into law by Woodrow Wilson. Rumors have it on his deathbed he regretted this as the worst thing he ever did as president. But we established this central bank. And the Federal Reserve, which, believe it or not, is actually not part of the United States government. It was never established under one of the three branches of government. One of the first things I ever looked into when I heard about the Federal Reserve, I'm like, okay, well, the U.S. Treasury, for example, if you don't know, is actually in the executive branch of government. You would think it might be legislative, obviously not judicial, but it's actually under the executive branch. But the Federal Reserve was created as a private group of bankers, basically the same way that the oil industry and railroad markets and steel had consolidated. We now had this consolidation of banking power, and it was owned by a group of banking families. We can actually go back and look at who was distributed the original shares of the Federal Reserve Bank when it was first established. And it reads like a who of the time of the most powerful banking families in the world. So after some intense meetings and an interesting collusion of people that met at Jekyll Island, Georgia, at the hunting lodge of Paul Wahlberg, the plan was ensued and the Federal Reserve Act was passed. Nelson Aldrich proposed the plan to Congress, but most of the congressmen understood that Aldrich's relationships were pretty much aligned with the big bankers, so they pushed back against it. So the plan was reissued to Congress under the name the Federal Reserve Act, although it was word for word the same act that Aldrich had proposed. They simply renamed it. But by using the words Federal Reserve Bank, it seemed to allude to the idea that we had created a federal agency.
Right.
Just because you use the word federal doesn't mean it's part of the U.S. government. So we established the U.S. Federal Reserve, whose job it is in 1913 to, again, create an environment of stable economic environments, full employment, and a stable dollar. But if you look at what's happened to the U.S. dollar since the Federal Reserve was charged with that, we have lost relatively 99% of the purchasing power of money since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. So I don't think they've done a good job.
No, and on my program, I talk a lot about inflation. You can find them all over the internet, but there's inflation calculators. And if you set it to go way back to, say, 1920 and then compare it today, the purchasing power of $1, it's really amazing when you look at it. Early on in the 20th century, a dollar was pretty valuable. Now, a dollar won't even buy you a candy bar.
Think about what the minimum wage used to be for $1.25, even up to the mid-1960s. That was a minimum wage. And $1.25 an hour was enough to feed a family of four, for one person working to make enough money to buy a home and actually have enough money for, maybe a vacation once a year for the family. Today, of course, we recognize that, it takes 2.5 people's income to make the needs of an average family of four, because one person's income exclusively goes to pay taxes, which, of course, were not as prevalent in the early 20th century. The idea of a central bank doing a job and what they've actually done, they are about as far apart as one could have expected. And I hearken back to the rationale of the founding fathers of why they argued against this in the first place, that we could have always had the operations of the Fed managed under the U.S. Treasury Department. We did not or do not need to sub that job out to a third party, especially a group of bankers that are mostly foreign, and ownership of a central bank with people that are not even within the United States, to me, is sort of disingenuous at best, but it clearly does not benefit the public. And it leads to the fundamental problem of the control now of the value of our money on a day-to-day basis is left in the hands of this Federal Reserve System. And our current chairman, Jerome Powell, he is basically the person that we look to decide, for example, how interest rates will run. And this is part of what the central banks do. Do they raise rates, lower rates? How do they decide when to do that? How does that impact the average person? And I've always believed that as long as we have a central bank that's not owned or controlled by the public, we have a flaw in our system. And that's going to create that inflation that you experience. And this is my rationale for people owning the original gold and silver that the founding fathers believed should have been the way we run a monetary system. And it was, from the 1790s until the 1960s.
It's amazing, the increase in the value of gold. And that's kind of a misnomer too, because it's not really the increase in the value of gold, rather it's the decrease in the value of the dollar.
Yeah, they are kind of mirror images. I've always said that the dollar is sort of like the mirror image of the US dollar, and the gold prices are exactly that. So effectively, the ounce of gold, if you have one in your hands today, is the same as it was in 1795. Nothing has changed except what it buys or how many paper dollars it takes to buy it. And that's that combination of events that occur when you can change the value of one but not the other. So the value of paper money, of course, is subject to change if the central bank, this Federal Reserve, deems that, okay, we think it's necessary to create more money. And a lot of people ask, well, why do they do that? Well, the reason they increase the supply of money is because the government spends more than it brings in. And because we haven't locked the government down to only being able to spend money that it has gold, like, for example, sitting in Fort Knox to back up each of these dollars, that is no longer the case. So the government has the ability to spend money and knows that the Federal Reserve will print whatever money the government doesn't have. Like, you hear this nonsense every few months when the government runs out of money and we hit these debt limits. So they've spent all the money that Congress has authorized them to spend, and they're out. Well, what happens now? They have to raise more money. How do they do that? Well, they can raise your taxes. They can print more money. They can issue more bonds. But all of these things inflate the value of currency. So the public is stuck with this onset. But if we lock the government down to a gold standard, that would prevent them from overspending. But since we haven't done that, that's why the price of gold reflectively keeps getting higher and higher against the value of the US dollar, which perpetually is buying less and less.
So quick question, Fred. I mean, we've pretty much gone all the way up to, the early 1900s with the creation of the Federal Reserve and how that came about. Up until which point was, and I know you and I have talked about this before, but just for my audience, up until which point was our money based on gold? Was it backed by gold?
Okay, so the Federal Reserve establishes itself in 1913 and maintains a gold standard at that point. So you would be able to take a $20 paper bill, walk into any Federal Reserve Bank in 1913, 14, 15, and redeem it for the 1 ounce gold coin that it was represented by. That was your right as an American citizen, and it was printed right on your paper money. Redeemable to the bearer on demand. That was a promissory note. Like, no crap, here it is. Legitimate, reasonable, very well spelled out, easy to understand. This is not merely a piece of paper, but it's actually backed by something, and it is redeemable at your discretion. You have the option. That existed until 1933. At that point, because of the Great Depression, the problem became that we could not provide the physical gold in sufficient quantities if everybody tried to redeem their paper all at once. So what they did is they continued to have a gold standard, but removed the redeemability clause. This was step one. So if we're going to take the value of money away from having a gold standard, the first part is cut off the redeemability window. But the promise was, we're saying to you, David, we promise to keep gold in Fort Knox in equal quantity to all these notes we issue. However, you just can't ask for it. You just have to trust us.
Oh, yeah, I really trust the government. So,
right, because, governments never lie, right?
No. Politicians, newspapers, whatever. But so quick question. So we've got this gold standard. The U.S. government says we're going to print one currency, and it's all going to be backed by gold, regardless of if you can exchange your paper for gold.
Silver.
Or silver. Where's all this gold at?
At that time, Fort Knox, Kentucky, was the major stay of where the gold reserves were held. Over the years, they started moving supplies of gold to the Federal Reserve Bank building in New York. And actually today, a strategic stockpile of gold is physically held in Fort Knox. But the bulk of the U.S. wealth in gold is actually in New York. It's in the sub-treasury building in the Federal Reserve Bank, and it's used for trading around the world. So if they should go and audit Fort Knox, they're going to find that there is actually gold there. There won't be any surprises. It would certainly be, one of those, who was it, Geraldo Herrera, who opened up, the vault of
Al Capone.
Al Capone and found it empty. They had this whole hype and they open up the vault, but there's nothing in there. They won't have that problem if they go to Fort Knox. I mean, that gold is securely there. But actually, strategically, we hold reserves of lots of things, oil and things of that nature as well. It just turns out physically that's where the original gold reserves, and it's so well known as the place of gold storage. But technically, most of the gold held by the United States is actually at the Federal Reserve Bank building in New York, which was important until Richard Nixon became president in 1971. He began to realize that this money situation had gotten a little unwieldy. The amount of paper floating around really didn't match the amount of gold that the government held. And that was becoming very clear to a lot of people. They were just simply doing the math. They could look at how much money the government was printing, and they were like, there's no way we have that much gold in reserve. So what Nixon did is he said, as this promise had stood since 1933, he turned to the public and said, okay, well, we're going to change the rules. And although we've been promising you for the last 40 years that there is an actual equivalency between the amount of paper and gold, we're going to say from now on that we're just simply going to print U.S. dollars and not maintain either a gold or silver reserve against them. We're going to have what we call fiat money, and the backing of it is now limited to, the quote is, the good faith and credit of the United States government. And that's what we've had as a monetary system since the 1970s.
Well, now there's one little point I think we might be glossing over that might be at least at the very least tangentially related. What about the Gold Confiscation Act?
Well, in 1933, we ran into a bit of an issue, as I said, and the fact that the government didn't have enough supplies of gold, what they did is they asked the public, in order to solve the Great Depression problem. And just to back up one step, when we talk about a depression, we're talking about an economic environment where there is a lack of cash, a lack of money. This is different than a recession, which is a slowing economy. A depression, by definition, means that there's literally no cash available. Because what had happened is as we got closer and closer to the 1933 date, more people began to redeem their paper money for gold. They became suspicious. And as the gold was being withdrawn from the treasury, you had to destroy the paper note that was turned in for redemption. Otherwise, it could be redeemed again. So if all the money is coming into the treasury and being destroyed, and all the gold is being drawn out, within a short period of time, within about 6 months, we ended up with a devastating problem of very little physical gold in the treasury's vault and all the money that was in circulation being destroyed. People literally couldn't be paid because employers didn't have the actual cash to give to their employees. So this lack of cash created a horrible economic environment. This Great Depression lasted for, years and years and years. And the resolution to it was to say, well, what if we could convince the public to give us the physical gold they had? We would give them in exchange paper notes with this promise that we would sustain their value, even though the redemption would be off the books. So that's how we replenished the gold reserve, was the Great Recall in 1933 under FDR. He simply asked the public to, basically it was like, look, do us this favor because we're all Americans, and this is how we have to act together to solve this big economic crisis. So you have a financial crisis where I think it was 25% of the people were out of work. I mean, the unemployment lines, it was horrific. It was the worst economic environment America's ever seen. People were completely devastated by the unemployment problem. You couldn't find jobs. There were very little jobs that paid any money. So they offered a solution. And the solution was, okay, give us your private gold. We'll put that into the Treasury's vaults, then utilize that gold to print more money. And this will alleviate this lack of cash problem that the country is experiencing. And the public went for it. So they believed that the government was telling them the truth, that this was the only solution to the depression that had exhibited itself for the past 7 or 8 years in the U.S. economy. And the public turned over their private gold. The government gave them back notes that said they were gold backed but not redeemable, and that's how we got that public to give up their own private gold. And believe it or not, it was illegal in America to own gold from 1933 until 1971, until Nixon again released the standard. And once that release existed, it wasn't necessary anymore to prevent people from turning their money into gold. So 1971, gold is released at $35 an ounce.
Wow.
Okay. Now, a lot of people immediately started buying gold with their paper money as soon as they were legally allowed, because they hadn't been for, almost 40 years. And of course, the price of gold starts going up because this massive demand. Around the world, we have had investors and foreign countries stockpiling US dollars. They also began their redemption, looking for the gold. So the money was piling in. Gold reserves started going down, and the price begins to escalate. By 1977, we'd hit $100 for the first time in an ounce price per gold. By 1980, it had skyrocketed to $850 an ounce from $35 just years earlier in 1971. And this was completely in response to this unbacked nature of gold. And the public is beginning to get a little more suspicious about the idea of how a paper dollar would possibly sustain value if we don't have a gold reserve anymore. Inflation skyrocketed because of the influx of money pouring into America. And we had interest rates go up to, 18, 19% in the 1980s. And, if you took out a mortgage in 1980, 82, you're talking 19, 20% interest rates. So this stuff peaked by, the early 1980s. And then eventually, of course, by the Fed raising rates to slow down this economic inflationary problem, we eventually choked the economy down because, if you make it so expensive for you and me and anybody else to borrow money, you're going to bring an economy to its knees.
Sure.
So it's a mechanism by which you can apply the brakes, so to speak. And the Fed did that to extreme levels in the 1980s, which is why we had that massive inflation. And a lot of people never experienced anything like it until just recently, where we had the high inflation we've had in the past few years. We went through almost an entire generation of Americans who never went through a high inflationary period until recently. And my God, did they, when they were shocked, they just didn't know what to make of it.
So let me ask you a question. I mean, we've gone through a lot of these economic cycles. We just talked about how, FDR had the Gold Confiscation Act, and then President Nixon released the gold so you could buy it at a relatively inexpensive amount. And then, there was a rush on gold, and it caused the value of it to go up. Now, recently, there's been a lot of discussion about releasing government records. So just before we got on the program, I was watching a special on who really was involved in the JFK assassination. Trump
Okay.
said,
Yeah, I've been waiting for 50 years for those things to come out.
Yeah, I'm still not impressed. Anyway, but one of the things that Trump said he was going to release is he said, we're going to go see if there's gold in Fort Knox. Now, earlier on in the program, you said, absolutely, there's gold in Fort Knox, no question about it. Now, over the years, there have been television programs where they've allowed cameras inside Fort Knox. I think there was one maybe at 60 Minutes or another program like that in the 90s. And then Steve Mnuchin, of course, went in and looked at the gold in Fort Knox. Aside from those two programs, how are you so certain that there's a whole bunch of gold in Fort Knox, that it's actually there and we haven't spent it or lost it or given it away? How do you know?
Well, but I don't. I mean, I guess I'm basing it on the fact that I don't really see a rationale for them to lie about it. It's almost pointless. Again, since we don't have a gold standard, what would they prove except the fact that the government has been lying to the public again? I mean, that's certainly not going to come as any surprise. I don't think it would affect much economically if they were to do that and have the Geraldo Rivera type of event, and open up the empty vault. I really don't think it would have a lot of impact. It might shock a few people, but in reality, the fact that there's no basis for gold as a standard against the US dollar anyway, it hardly really would change much, except again, to provide evidence the government has been lying. You want to think that your government has a strategic supply of a precious metal like that. You want to believe that, because people are still somewhat convinced, and a lot of people don't know that there is no backing of US dollars anymore with gold or silver. I still talk to people even today. This is 2025, and we're still talking to people who, for the first time, are coming to understand that nothing backs the US dollar anymore. So I don't know how much of a big deal it really would be, but the only rationale I have for believing it is the fact that I don't think it would be a big surprise if it turned out it weren't there, but I don't see any reason why they would lie about it. There's no really fundamental benefit for them to do that. And the fact that, the periodic times where people have stuck their head in the door, effectively there have been no surprises. So again, that just leads to my conviction. I've kind of followed where the gold reserves have been supplied. And, I've looked at the numbers of what the Federal Reserve Bank is holding, how much the U.S. government is supposed to have, but when you look at the total supplies of gold that have been mined, since day one, it really doesn't amount to a whole hell of a lot. It's a rather surprising statistic. It's quite small when you consider the number of metric tons of gold that have ever been mined. But I don't know. I guess I could be wrong about this. And, they might open up the vault and find nothing, but I really just find that hard to believe. It doesn't seem like there would be any benefit to lying about something like that.
Well, I'll tell you what convinces me is that we have depositories in other places in the country. There's Denver, New York. There's probably a couple of others scattered around the country. And, we know that Fort Knox is one of the most, if not the most, impenetrable facility in America.
Sure.
And so if you're going to have depositories in other places, you would use that one there. And I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me that there wouldn't be gold in Fort Knox. And, even though the amount of, like you just said, the amount of gold that we have is in no way even anywhere in the same ballpark as the amount of dollars that are in circulation.
Oh, no, they're not even related anymore.
We're, $36 trillion in debt. And I doubt, I don't know, what is there, $4 or $5 trillion worth of gold?
Yeah. And if you look at the debt, unfortunately, that's only the bondable debt. There's a lot more out there in debt that we don't talk about, because the government doesn't like to account for things that it has as future obligations as a debt, which is sort of like saying that you don't believe that you owe money because your credit card bill hasn't shown up yet. That's just stupid. I'm sorry. If you spent $10,000 on your credit card, just because the bill hasn't shown up in the mail doesn't mean you don't owe $10,000. It's just a question of when you have to write the check. And we play that game all the time in the United States government. When you look at its actual obligations, most people have calculated it to be 3 to 5 times the 36 trillion that we talk about on a regular basis. And I keep looking at these obligations saying, how do you ever meet that? It'd be like spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a month on credit cards if you're making 50 grand a year. There's just no way you could ever pay it back. You might be able to chip away at some of the interest payments, but like the U.S. government, we're at a point where they're having a struggle to just make interest on that 36 trillion, which is now over $1 trillion a year. And that's a lot of money for a government to have to come up with. That's $1 trillion worth of either tax collections or bond sales. And this is what's starting to concern me in our current situation. This all leads to the U.S. government's need to have to sell a lot of its debt instruments to foreign investors because we've soaked up all the domestic buyers. They've asked everybody in America support the U.S. government by buying T-bills and bonds and treasuries. But the problem is that we are creating so much debt that the public and the companies within the United States are not big enough to absorb all the amount of debt. So we have to lean on the foreign world and say, please buy U.S. government debt. So central banks around the other countries in the world do that. And investors around the world do that because the U.S., as crazy as this may seem, is still the most stable of all the countries out there in terms of their currency. So our need to sell debt is growing and growing and growing. But at some point, how many people can buy government bonds? And how much would they want to have if the government's ability to repay that becomes questionable? Or what if the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency fades, falters a bit? If there's an alternative that leads people to say, well, I'd rather buy that bond than the U.S. government bond, we have a huge problem in America. Because if we can't support our debt sales, that means domestically the only option we have left to deal with all of our debt and the interest payments is to literally print money, which of course is an option because we have this Federal Reserve Bank we've been talking about. If the Federal Reserve didn't exist, we couldn't do that. But since it does, and the government knows that it will, if needed, print that money, that option remains on the table. And the downside to that is that you and I then have to spend more of these paper dollars, which are becoming worth less, to continue to live the same lifestyle we're trying to live now. And of course, it's going to impact that price of gold, which will just keep progressively becoming more and more valuable. And there's just no end in sight to that because the rate at which we're doing this borrowing of money and printing of money, I can't even explain how rapidly it's accelerated. If you drew it as a graph, it's almost parabolic.
Yep. It's almost a straight line up.
Almost. So in other words, no time is passing, yet the increase in the supply of money is exploding. What used to take 10 or 15 years in additional money being printed is now happening within less than 1 year. We have so rapidly accelerated the printing of money, price increases are becoming so commonplace, and they're going to get far worse over the next few years because as this parabolic nature continues, the numbers are just getting, mind-boggling. It's hard to even grasp trillions. I mean, I
have no idea what that means. I've got a lot of friends who are legislators, and the question I always ask them is, okay, so before you became a legislator, big numbers. So, if you bought a $50,000 truck, I mean, that's a lot of money to me. There's no way I could afford a $50,000 truck. Or if you buy a house, now you're probably talking at $250,000, $500,000 around here.
Easily, yeah.
Easily buy a house. But when you get to the legislature, all of a sudden, those numbers are just pocket change. And magically, you start talking in terms of millions. But still $1 million when you're first in the legislature. That's still a lot of money. And then give it a couple of years, and pretty soon, $100 million, really not that much. And you start talking about budgets, like in the state of Wyoming, the budget they just passed was $11.5 to $11.8 billion for the little state of Wyoming, not little in landmass, little in people. So the question I always ask them is, do you really understand how big those numbers are? And the answer that I get from all of them is, I have no idea. All I know is that the bigger number pays for the bigger project.
Sure. So 1,000 million becomes a billion, 1,000 billion becomes a trillion. If I misstated that before, so that's what you're looking at. And again, it gets hard to get your head wrapped around because, human beings don't experience anything in that size in their average daily life. There's just nothing you experience that has that kind of volume to it except the amount of money that exists in an economy.
All right, so let's circle all the way back. We know that we've got a financial problem. We know that if there is gold in Fort Knox, and I'm pretty well convinced that there is,
I think so.
It in no way compares to the amount of money that is floating around. Let's go back to the Federal Reserve, where we started this conversation.
Sure.
What would the Federal Reserve have to do, or what would we have to do with the Federal Reserve to put the brakes on the rampant money printing, the rampant spending, and the almost ununderstandable escalation in our debt? What would we have to do?
That's a great question because that's really what it comes down to. So two things could happen. The first thing I would do if I were in power, I would eliminate the Federal Reserve completely and put all of its operations immediately under the auspices of the United States Treasury. My rationale for this is I would rather have it under the U.S. government because we can always vote people out. You cannot vote out anybody in the Federal Reserve. So the argument tends to be, from the other point of view, the Fed should remain independent and shouldn't be part of Congress to keep it from being influenced by political parties. I dispute that argument. I think it's more important that the issue of money be under the control of the public who has to use that money. I don't think we should be subbing that out to a private group of bankers. I just don't believe that that's appropriate. So that could be step one. Of course, I find that hard to believe we'd ever get there. I mean, we've had like Congressman Ron Paul, for example, his entire career, who has been trying to end the Fed and has gotten absolutely nowhere.
Nowhere.
Although he's made valid arguments for decades. So then he shifted to saying, okay, well, if we can't get rid of it, can we at least audit it? He couldn't even get Congress to agree to audit the Fed. So with that kind of established power, it seems unlikely to me that step one, in my opinion, remove the Fed completely and let the Treasury handle all this, is ever going to happen. Step two, the more important one, is you have to somehow constrain Congress from spending the money it doesn't have. In other words, we have to prevent them from working under the system where they know that there's a default process available to them, that if they overspend, that the Fed can simply print their way out of the problem. And this is their solution now to everything. I've watched this evolution of the past decade, especially, how the government has shifted from trying to come up with a political solution. They've given up. And they've simply said, well, don't worry about it. We'll just let the Fed print the money. Even though that's going to impact the wealth of every American and devastate the value of money they're trying to save, they don't care about that. They would rather see the inflation of money and allow them to solve their problems and keep spending and spending and spending. Otherwise, what Congress would have to do is, cut the expenditures dramatically. And I'm talking way beyond what DOGE is trying to do, although that's a good first step. Yeah, it's a good first step. But, I mean, if you really want to attack that problem, you need to get into that a lot deeper. But that's the type of thing that would have to happen. You'd have to massively reduce the amount the government spends. But let's say theoretically we could even accomplish that. Okay, let's say that somehow we get to the point where we get Congress to say, we'll never spend another penny more. This is it. They still have to address the $36 trillion in bonded debt and all of the other obligations it has coming up over the next few years. So we haven't solved anything, even if we stop the bleeding today. It's past the point. There's a political way of dealing with this. There is only one solution to the size of our problem, and that's to print money. So I think the public should sort of accept the notion we're not going to fix this. And they should anticipate that their dollars are going to get a lot weaker, because I see no other way for the government to deal with the amount of obligations it has. Can you imagine if the U.S. government turned to you and said, you bought a note from the U.S. Treasury, a 10-year note, and now 10 years has expired and you're now due full payment. And the government says, well, I'm sorry, we don't have the money.
Yeah.
We promised you we would, but we don't have it. So we're going to default on that bond payment. Well, my God, that would set off a cascading series of events that would just absolutely destroy the U.S. economy. And within about a week, we would look like a third world nation. We'd be printing money so rapidly, it would be insane. It would be like Argentina when they experienced 1,000% annual inflation. I mean, just absolute insanity. There would be riots on the streets. Look how crazy people went when they couldn't get toilet paper, or the price of eggs went up, right? There's no way the public would stand for this calmly if we devastated the value of the dollar. And I hearken back to what Henry Ford said at the beginning of the 20th century. He said, if the American people ever understood the way monetary policies actually work in the United States, there would be revolution on the streets before morning. And he said that in like 1920.
Yeah.
And here we are now, 100 years later, we still haven't learned the lesson. So I don't know if there's a solution. I really don't.
And I think the only solution is for, and I say this about just about everything, the only solution really is to take care of yourself. Like if you understand, or at least have an idea of what the problem is, that is, the government spends too much money. We all know that. That they're destroying the value of the dollar. Maybe we all intuitively know that. We see that at the grocery store. And when when a $50,000 truck turned into a $100,000 truck, and it's right, you're still getting the same truck. We all get it, but I think the solution is to just protect yourself, and that's where your company comes in.
That is a great point, because if I've said this number of times, that if the government will not provide us with sound money, and that's money that will be stable in its value, in other words, the ability for you to earn it today, save it for 10 years, use it 10 years later, and actually have it buy the same amount of goods. If our government will not provide us with that, it's up to the individual to protect your own wealth. Don't ask the government to try to provide you with wealth protection when they're in this kind of situation where there's nothing they can do about it anymore. And I don't care who becomes president. I don't care what promises they make when they're on the campaign trail. They're not going to solve this problem in anytime soon. So I believe you're absolutely right. Individuals need to take responsibility to protect their own wealth. And that is exactly what our company is trying to do by providing that physical asset to the public that they can take possession of. It'll counterbalance this weakness in paper money and at least give them a leg up, a chance to stay ahead. Because that silver quarter from 1964, 1965, 25 cents in 1964 was the cost of a gallon of gas. So, you take a silver quarter today, it's got $5 worth of melt value. You can buy one for $6 or so.
Right.
It'll buy a couple gallons of gas. Its purchasing power has not changed. It's increased, if anything. But if you look at how much paper money it's going to take to continually buy those same physical assets, whether it be that home or that truck, those things will progressively have to become more expensive if the value of the paper we're using against them is progressively getting weaker. So, yeah, I do believe in personal responsibility. I hate to say that, but, please, people, don't rely on the government. And for those that have relied on things like Social Security, look at the problem they have. They have a $3 trillion hole in the Social Security fund, and this was not the government's money. I mean, this is your money and my money. They did not ask us whether or not we wanted that taken out of our paycheck every week. They grabbed it, whether we wanted it or not, on the promise that this was held in trust, not going to be spent by anybody for any other purpose, and when we're old and retired, we'll be able to draw that money back. Well, they lied. They spent the money. So now in order to send out those Social Security checks and make sure that people, when they cash them, actually get money, where does the money come from? We're literally printing that, and that's it. And that, to me, is, a false promise. So I guess the general concept would be don't trust the government to protect your wealth when they're operating a system without sound money. So in order to solve the problem, we need a sound money system. We need to stop the ability to print money we don't have, or we need to back the currency with something stable, that provides a system where it won't be inflated and devalued.
Exactly. Well, Fred, I appreciate you taking the time to visit with me about the Federal Reserve and whether or not there's any money in Fort Knox. Hopefully we'll all find out the answer to that question.
Yeah, great to be with you. Should be interesting to watch what happens in the future. And, let's keep an eye on the price of gold and silver and see how things progress.
All right. Thanks, Fred. That'll do it for today's installment of Weekend Update. Have a good rest of your weekend, and we'll talk again on Monday. But for now, from the base of the Bighorns at the Cowboy State Politics Studio, I'm David Iverson, and this is the one and only Cowboy State Politics.